I hope this is all live. There we go.
Got it.
All right.
This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to the second Citations Needed Begathon. That is our periodic virtual live show fundraiser. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us as we stream live on YouTube. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at Citations Pod, Facebook, Citations Needed. And if you're not already, we'd obviously really like you to become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated as we are 100% listener funded.
And when you become a supporter, as always, you'll get access to over 130 news briefs, extensive show notes for every episodes, and more fun stuff like live interviews and other Patreon goodies for those who help support the show, live chats, bringing those back, etc. So please do that if you can. This is after all a begathon, so
it is. That is why that is partly why we're here. We also have other things to discuss, but definitely if you do not already support the show, please consider it. And throughout this episode, throughout this show, you will be potentially rewarded for supporting the show because we're going to be giving some stuff away. But tonight on Citations Needed, we will be talking primarily about two TV series: the History Channel's Ancient Aliens and Netflix's Ancient Apocalypse, as well as the kind of wider genre of cheap, right-wing, pseudo-archaeological infotainment that they're both a part of. And joining us in just a little bit to discuss this will be Dr. David S. Anderson, an archaeologist and assistant professor at Radford University in Virginia. He specializes in the study of pseudo-archaeology and is the author of a forthcoming book entitled Weirding Archaeology, Unearthing the Strange Influences on the Popular Perception of Archaeology.
But first, a quick note about what we're doing tonight. Citations Needed takes a team of people, ton of work, ton of research, ton of writing, and we do it. I think at a pretty good clip, a pretty good pace. We don't take long breaks. We try to have as many fresh episodes. We respond to current events with news briefs. Since the show premiered back in July of 2017, we've done 180 episodes, 130 news briefs with over 250 guests. We love doing this, and we're grateful, of course, for every listener, every download, every tweet, all the feedback we get. We're very humbled by it. We've had roughly 20 million downloads, approximately. We think that's a pretty fair estimate based on the metrics we have. We don't think we're inflating it, but if we are, sorry. Now, we never run commercials. We never run sponsored content. I know this is extremely rare for a podcast of our listenership. We get solicited all the time to do that. And it's not because we're holier than thou, although maybe we're kind of a little bit holier than thou. It's mostly because it's just not part of what we set out to do with the show. You can't really rail against the evils of capitalism and then 5 seconds later pitch things. It doesn't really work aesthetically on a superficial level as well. But also, we really like to keep the show independent, like to keep it totally user supported. It's something we set out to do from the beginning. And the only reason that's possible is through supporters like you on Patreon. So twice a year we come out and we do we're influenced by NPR. We do the little begathon where we directly ask you for money. We humiliate and prostrate ourselves and say, please,
Indeed.
if you can.
So many times say please.
So many, yeah, we say please donate to the show because we do know there is a large contingent of people who do listen and don't donate, which people have their reasons. But if the reason is you just haven't got around to doing it, you should probably do it. If the reason is you don't do it because you don't have the money, then keep stealing our content. That's kind of the shtick we're asking for tonight. And so we like to make these begathons, fun, more interesting, more based on pop culture. Although we'll get into why pseudo-archaeology is not just a funny thing, it's also kind of pernicious, but we'll get into the more scoldy stuff later. But for now,
we always eat our vegetables too.
We always have to eat a little bit of vegetables, right?
So yeah, here's the thing. Like, even with our millions of downloads, and again, that is amazing and a ridiculous number, and thank you all. relatively few listeners compared to our listenership actually support the show and the work of the 7 people on our team that it takes to make this show. So tonight, as Adam said, we're asking if you have the means, if you're able, if you're interested, please do go to our Patreon page. Again, that is patreon.com/citations needed podcast and sign up to support. That would be so great. And if the warm feeling of being a Citations Needed patron is not quite enough, well, we're going to sweeten the deal tonight with some incentives. So before we start talking about the fun stuff and, how escapists leave your brain at the door crap TV might also have some sinister ulterior motives. Of course, this is Citations Needed after all. We want to explain how this begathon is going to work. In addition to asking you, dear, wonderful, extremely attractive, smart, brilliant listener, to please financially support our show, we're also giving away some Citations Needed swag along the way. We have some stuff to give away to folks who are joining us right now. And either sign up to support the show for the first time as you're watching, or, of course, also for current patrons who raise their level of support from whatever level they're at, or just increase the amount. Doesn't have to be by much, but just a little bit during this begathon. So during this live broadcast, we're going to give away a prize or two every 15 to 20 minutes. To folks who have joined us tonight. So listen closely during the show and we'll let you know how to get your name in the running. And so we're going to start off with our first giveaway right now before we get to our topic. And of course, it's a fundraiser, so we have to start with the Citations Needed tote bag. So for all of you live streaming this on YouTube right now, please go to patreon.com/citations needed podcast, sign up to support the show in the next 15 minutes or so, and drop a comment in the YouTube chat, not the Patreon chat, but the YouTube chat after you do so to let us know. If you're already a supporter of the show and you decide to raise your level of support or increase the amount that you're already giving generously, incredibly, thank you. Let us know about that too, because that will also put you in the running. And one of you generous listeners will be selected at random to receive a Citations Needed tote bag. We will let you know who that winner is. Of course, we don't have free merch for everyone listening tonight. We wish we did, but don't worry. We'll keep doing this kind of thing throughout the show. And if you're just dying for that sweet, sweet citation swag, just head over to our merch store at bonfire.com. And you can just search for Citations Needed there, bonfire.com. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead. No, I think that are we good? Are we done with the groveling? Should we move
I think
on
we're done with the groveling.
All right, no more groveling.
Can we do this? Let's get into
groveling.
this.
I have some pride and dignity left. Let's hold on to that.
We're gonna ruin that by hour 6.
So tonight we're diving in to some of the more degenerate programming on television, namely Ancient Aliens of the History Channel and Ancient Apocalypse more recently on Netflix. We're examining both tonight because while there is a gap in their respective levels of production value, they have much in common ideologically. They sort of suffer from similar worldviews about them taking on big evil archaeology, which we'll get into later. They evoke kind of right-wing distrust of the scientific establishment in a kind of mindless and faux populist way. And they're fundamentally predicated on the idea that indigenous societies couldn't possibly have been as sophisticated as they were, and that there has to be some sort of extraordinary outside third party who came in and sort of did all these really interesting and wonderful things. While they've kind of hedged a little bit on this with respect to introducing ancient aliens in Italy and Norway, sort of, but generally speaking, the origins of this line of reasoning, which we'll get into, especially ancient aliens, is basically that these primitive people in this certain society, this racialized society, are incapable of doing this really, really awesome thing. And so that's one of the reasons why we're excited to talk about this tonight. And we sort of wanted to frame these two, one older, one more recent, but all of which have their origins decades ago.
Yeah, so since we're talking history, let's first get a sense of where these absurd ideas come from. The myths of Atlantis are millennia old. We can go back to Plato for that. But as previous guest of the pod, just look into episode 82, Dr. Sarah E. Bond has written that the philosophical basis for these TV shows, right, Ancient Aliens, Ancient Apocalypse, and these broader notions really originated in the 19th century through European science fiction, namely that of H.G. Wells, especially, of course, his 1898 book, War of the Worlds, that imagined aliens accomplishing great feats of engineering on Earth. Now, author Garrett P. Service's 1898 book, Edison's Conquest of Mars, which sought to mimic the spirit and the success of War of the Worlds, told the story of quote-unquote giants of Mars who built the Great Pyramids and Great Sphinx in Egypt. Service's book was serialized in newspapers like the LA Herald and the Gazette of York, Pennsylvania. Other similar sci-fi works followed, also appearing as books or serialized pieces in local papers. So now, some 70 years later, the 1968 book, Chariot of the Gods, right? There's a question mark. Chariot of the Gods? Unsolved Mysteries of the Past, by Swiss author Erich von Daniken, would posit that aliens created or influenced many of the works of ancient societies, such as the pyramids of Giza, the Nazca lines of Peru, and even the much more modern Moai of Easter Island. The book became a bestseller in Europe and then further popularized throughout the US by being serialized in the National Enquirer that same year. The film was dubbed into English and released in US theaters a few years later. Now, we also want to note that Jason Colavito, the writer, has written extensively about this book and the broader topic of pseudo-archaeology. Definitely check out his work if you are so inclined. But we're going to keep digging into the influence of von Daniken and where that has led us.
These pseudo-archaeological theories would soon reach an even wider audience. In 1970, Chariots of the Gods was adapted into a West German film by the same name, treated as a documentary and nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. And in 1973, NBC adapted the book into a special entitled In Search of Ancient Astronauts, hosted by Rod Serling, the famed presenter of The Twilight Zone. Here's a clip from that NBC special.
If ancient astronauts did land here, what effect would they have had upon early Earthmen? Perhaps they were worshipped, feared, loved. Perhaps they brought gifts, a new world of knowledge, or simply the principle of the lever. If we accept the premise that beings from another civilization visited here ages ago, then some of the mysteries of our past take on a new and startling light.
So I love hearing Rod Serling do that. It gives it gravitas that it doesn't deserve.
Well, it was the 70s, man. I feel like there was all kinds of wacky shit going on then. I can sort of have a little bit more leverage. The whole revolution thing burned out. Everyone was looking for alternatives,
And they're like, all right, let's do it.
Some good came out of it. I think we saved the ozone layer, created the EPA, but some bad stuff came. It was kind of a mixed bag. But anyway,
whales are doing all right. All right, so
better. Thank you.
So, with that great Rod Serling intro, we have so much more to get to, and so we are going to bring on our guest. So joining us to help make sense of this very weird pocket of pop culture is Dr. David S. Anderson, archaeologist and assistant professor at Radford University in Virginia, specializes in the study of pseudo-archaeology, who better to have on the show, and is the author of a forthcoming book, Weirding Archaeology, Unearthing the Strange Influences on the Pop Culture Perception of Archaeology. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm happy to be here, and I'm not sure if I want to thank you for taking me down the memory alley with Rod Serling there or not, but there are lots of strings to pull on here.
Well, I'm excited to start pulling on those strings. We want to start off by giving a background of the show Ancient Aliens. I think it's kind of the main thing we'll be talking about here today. Certainly the most popular, been memed to death, watched by hundreds of millions of people. over the course of its run since 2009, when it premiered as a 2-hour documentary special that was swiftly adapted into a series. Its general premise starts. The way it basically works is they take a sort of a gap of knowledge, because obviously studying things that happened 4,000 or 5,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago even can be difficult. We have to piece together information. Obviously, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge by definition, sometimes hundreds of years. And then the show sort of takes those gaps in knowledge and then says, what if it's aliens? Which again, in theory, can be harmless enough or kind of playful. But as we'll get into with our guest, Dr. Anderson, it's very much oftentimes anything but. So the way we want to formulate this is I want to sort of start the conversation by we're going to watch a clip, and then we'll kind of riff from there. I know you have many thoughts about that, so we'll get into all those thoughts. But this first clip is from season 7. It presents the South African San culture as having DNA different from other humans, allowing them to harness something he calls, quote, they call, quote, noom energy. And so we're going to watch this clip. We sort of watched a bunch of the shows and found what we thought were some of the more ridiculous parts of it. So let's watch this clip to start off with, and then we'll go from there.
Millions of people around the world believe we have been visited in the past by extraterrestrial
Oh wait, hold on. This is
beings.
actually the intro we're watching
What
first.
if
My fault.
It were true.
So I love the
Did
intro.
ancient aliens really help to shape our history?
We can watch the intro. Is that it? Sorry, that was my mistake. I went ahead in the script. I apologize. Yeah, so let's start off by talking about the intro, actually, if you don't mind. Then we'll get into the clip
Sure.
about the Sean people in a second. So the thing I love about the intro is it's a bunch of questions. It's sort of just asking questions, right? This is sort of a similar kind of Glenn Beck, Alex Jones, just asking questions. Can you talk about that formulation? I find it, if I'm teaching a class on sophistry, I would play the intro to Ancient Aliens, because they don't say like, did aliens come? And then they sort of seem like they need to solve that question. They say, and if they did, what did they do? And if they did, what did they leave behind? It's like, well, wait a second, so let's talk about the intro and how it sort of primes the audience to get smoke blown up their ass.
Yeah, and this definitely, the show, when it debuted, was deliberately in honor of von Daniken's book back from '68, Chariots of the Gods, with the question mark. Name is absolutely right. Like, the question mark is deliberate there. And it is entirely a rhetorical strategy that allows them to dodge out of the way if they ever get cornered on something. This has happened with von Daniken a few times over the years. He doesn't give a lot of critical interviews, but it's, it presents this very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just like this, what's wrong with asking questions? Why is it possible? We just want to know more about the past. Well, there's a problem if you don't actually have any data or evidence to back those claims up. And so, there's that facade of innocence is really masking deliberate misinformation.
So if you can you comment on that sort of rhetorical strategy? Why you think it kind of popular, why it works, why it's effective? Again, it's a strategy we see in other other currents of trying to smuggle in batshit stuff where you really don't want to commit to it. Can you talk about that strategy and how perhaps maybe, to use their own phrase, the archaeological establishment, right? This kind of sinister sort of cabal of Freemasonry. Can we talk about how establishment archaeology maybe approaches it differently?
Yeah, big archaeology, which I am apparently a member of, has got a lot of problems. And this rhetorical strategy is inviting. It draws people in. It makes you, the listener, the reader, part of the fight back, or part of uncovering that mystery. And it's totally understandable that draws people in. And there are moments where things like this have drawn me in my own past. Archaeology, academic archaeology, we've got we have lots of public outreach problems. And that's why I love to come and talk with guys like you and do shows like this. because I think myself and my colleagues need to be talking to the public more often as possible. And we need to be talking about sort of what we do and how we do it and how we come up with answers to research questions, because we're not just making up our answers. I've gotten this a lot of times where it's like, oh, I don't know, how are these answers different from any other? Like, well, we go out and excavate, we collect data, we collect pottery, we collect stone tools, we map architecture, we collect eco facts that are left over plant remains and whatnot. Like, we have an incredibly broad set of data that we use to build up answers. But we suffer from that problem of other disciplines have this problem too, the professionalization of science. As different academic scientific endeavors have gotten more complex and more professionalized, the barrier to entry gets higher. You have to go to school more, you have to get a bachelor's, you have to get a master's, you have to get a PhD to become sort of a major part of that dialogue and contribution. And that shuts people out and it makes it harder. And there's a particular turn right when von Daniken's book came out in '68, there were big things happening where archaeology was becoming more university based and it was becoming more academic at that time. And it's the moment where we saw the rise of that kind of like publish or perish academic mindset in archaeology happen just when von Daniken was becoming popular. So in other words, archaeologists started spending a lot more time like talking to one another in peer-reviewed journals away from the public, and he grabbed a gap that my profession left behind.
And you think, okay, so that's a self-criticism we hear from a lot of academics, that the gap is filled by hucksters because there's not a lot of good PR. Now, the big question a lot of people have that we fielded in certain comment sections when we announced the show, et cetera, is if you watch the show, especially early on, they have actual academics, many of whom have stated publicly that they were kind of duped into this. Many of whom thought they could
cleverly edited,
or thought they could sort of smuggle in some real stuff. But then it's so brilliant. They go from the guy, professor of USC archaeology, Egyptology, blah, blah, blah. And then they cut into like this crank who the guy met in, New Mexico while doing peyote. And then they edit it so fast. They seem like, oh, they're all just sort of professional people. Can you talk about why beyond a certain point you feel like actual academics kept going on this show? Is it, I think some said they may have been paid. Can you comment on that? Because that's like the biggest question we get. And I want to get that out of the way early.
I get this from a lot of my colleagues for not so much for Ancient Aliens anymore. Most of them have realized they don't want to touch that. But for other new documentaries that come along, there's a strong desire to view these television documentaries as a way to talk to the public. And they're like, how else am I going to get my research out there? How else am I going to talk to the public? And so they're like, well, I guess I'll get at least a little bit of my story out of there. But you hand so much editorial control over to these folks that, I have a bunch of colleagues who I've talked to personally who have said like, yeah, I was just hoping I could get my story out there. And then they have all regretted it afterwards because they were, maybe not sliced and diced super badly, but just that context that they're put in, like you said, who are they going to talk to next, or who do they talk to before you? I've also had colleagues that documentary TV is an interesting industry, and there are lots of great documentaries out there, but there's a few times I've had folks where interviews can be subcontracted out, and who someone's talking to, they don't necessarily always know or realize where that footage is going to show up in the end. And so we've had some strange incidents over the years, in particular, where people have ended up giving interviews for one thing, and then their clip showed up in something totally different, or not what they expected it to be, and then it gets sliced and diced to make it sound like they're in support of something that they're not at all. So I hate even saying this, and I don't actually totally believe it, but there's part of me that wants to call for a boycott, where it's like, do not go on any TV show until we get some sort of like statement that they're not going to edit you out of context.
Right. Yeah. So, I think there's this combination of the just asking questions, right, piece, and if you say anything about that, or if you're like, well, but why are you asking those questions? Then you're part of, suppressing the truth,
Mhm.
potentially suppressing a truth, right? But then you also have this kind of academic validation at times. You have the, lower third chirons with people's names and credentials. You're like, oh, well, maybe there's something there. I mean, there's like a water line at the bottom of this. Maybe, I don't, how the fuck should I know? And so, but before we get to some of these next clips, which I'm super excited about, I have one additional question, which is, how do you think these shows, with their like aggressive attack on archaeologists and like archaeology as a study, as a practice, a field, how do you think like Indiana Jones made people want to become archaeologists? These shows seem to like hate archaeologists so much that it's actually doesn't seem to be like inviting into the field. It's actually just about doubting a current reality, which has ulterior motives than actually maybe like getting people into this thing. And I'm not saying that Indiana Jones, like,
well, it's fundamentally nihilistic,
is this,
right?
you know what I mean? But it is
fun-
fundamentally nihilistic in this,
Yeah.
like you're just supposed to doubt everything,
Well,
which is
them.
actually
Don't
less
doubt those
fun
guys.
than anything else.
Well, it's
But
also
don't doubt those
it's also Aliens is sort of like, well, again, I don't want to be some like Sam Harris atheist tryhard, but it is sort of a similar like, well, God did it, and it's like, well, okay, but what do you do after that? Like, what am I supposed to do with aliens did this? Are we supposed to like discover more about these? Like, it's sort of the end of the conversation.
Yeah, and it's trended for a lot of people who watch the show and like the show, and people who are on the show, Ancient Aliens, that have more and more is looking more and more like a religion, where it's like that ultimate goal is to just acknowledge aliens as the grand creators of all.
Yeah. So what do I do with that though? Like, what's the next line of inquiry? It seems
Watch the
like
show.
that's
Watch the next show.
Oh,
And-
buy the next book. Okay.
Yeah, but no, I guess to the hostility against. I mean, there is absolutely a legacy of anti-intellectualism and nihilism going on here. That they don't want, like, the mainstream archaeology, the big archaeologists are lying to you and covering things up. And there's a little bit. There have been bad actors in my field as well as most enterprises. Humans do bad things sometimes, and so there are absolutely examples that you can point to of archaeologists behaving badly. And in particular, archaeology is massively intertwined and entangled with colonialism over the last couple hundred years. There's a cult of personality going on sometimes. It feels like a lot, but I think this question too, though, speaks a lot to me. With I got interested in these topics when I was young. When I was about 18, I ended up buying one of Graham Hancock's early books, Fingerprints of the Gods, which the TV show Ancient Apocalypse still echoes a lot of those original ideas, all about sort of a lost civilization from 10 to 12,000 years ago that the mainstream archaeologists won't admit really exists. And I bought it hook, line, and sinker at the time. Like, oh, this is an amazing book, and I loved it. And I started taking archaeology classes because of that book, where I'm like, I want to know more about this, and I want to overturn that entrenched mainstream view. I think the thing more than anything that made me realize that there were problems with what Hancock was saying is, like, throughout the book, it's like archaeologists are assholes. And then I met archaeologists, and it's like, oh, they are passionately interested in learning about and studying and researching the past. And this academic boogeyman that he had portrayed is what was sort of the most immediately obviously not true to me. But I think there's almost a Carnival Barker sort of attitude sometimes in these kind of these publications. Don't listen to anyone. You can't trust anyone. But watch my show. Buy my book. You can't trust anyone, but buy my books.
Yeah, because I think we'll get into the problems with the actual problems with mainstream ideology. It sort of reminds me a lot of a lot of mindless anti-vax stuff. It's like the pharmaceutical companies are the most evil people in the world, but you managed to criticize them in a way that was like not the way. It's also a fundamentally conservative mode of criticism because it's not particularly subversive. Again, these shows are funded by A&E, by Warner Brothers, by Reed Hastings, who's a billionaire. Like, if it was genuinely subversive, would these billionaire corporations be shoveling shit down your throat? No, they wouldn't. Of course, obviously, by definition. I do want to jump into the clips if you'll indulge me. I know we teed one up earlier. I want to do that clip of the Noom energy, which I think you can buy on Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop website. But I want to talk a bit about.
Don't insert it anywhere in your body.
Yeah, not a good idea. So let's watch that clip now.
I've seen a bushman put a coal in his mouth and he wasn't burnt. They'll put their heads in the fire, and although their hair might singe and even catch fire, their face won't be burnt. So something is happening with this Noom energy. They call it boiling energy. It's almost like there's a vibrational change in their whole body and probably in their DNA in some way.
Could the so-called Noom energy really be inherent in shamans, accessed only while in a sort of dream state?
Sure, why not?
And is it possible that the genetic makeup of these medicine men is what allows them to access other dimensions?
The San Bush people have a tradition that they are the first tribe ever created. They're the oldest people in the world. DNA tests have shown that they probably are, that all other cultures and all other peoples that spread throughout the world came originally from where the San people are now.
When we look at the San Bushmen and we see the clear genetic evidence that they are the primordial seed of human civilization and life on Earth, it is possible that their DNA
We're getting the live reaction here from
especially
Dr.
well equipped.
Oh no, he's taking off the headphones. He can't take it. He's going to walk out.
Access these non-ordinary states of consciousness, which may in fact be a key
I love the stock
to
video.
physically journeying into them, giving these people the ability to do things that most of us seemingly cannot.
Okay.
Oh, that is glorious.
So what are your initial...
we thought you were going to walk out.
What are your initial...
I preface this by just saying I'm not a geneticist, and so I like my rocks and my pottery shirts, but what the mitochondrial DNA studies that they're referring to show that there's greater levels of diversity in genetics and among San people as well as other groups in Africa that suggests that they're older. That does not make them what did he say? The primordial civilization of human genetic diversity is this amazing, beautiful thing that is completely distinct from culture and the things that people do and build and make. I feel pretty comfortable just calling that entire clip bullshit.
Yeah, well, it's one thing to talk like to sort of do ancient aliens. This is like basically saying these people are currently aliens, which seems a little more quite literally dehumanizing.
Right.
And this is the
it is like literally the definition of dehumanizing, right?
Yeah, they have different DNA than us.
Yeah. There's something going on with
it's
them.
just so casual too.
Yeah,
yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. Before we get to our next clip or the next, frustrated yawp, we'd love to announce our first merch winner, just briefly. So congratulations to Catherine Turnbull on your brand new Citations Needed tote bag. Please do email us if you are listening right now. Email us right now at citationsneededcontact@gmail.com. That way we can get in touch and we can make sure that we get that out to you. Again, that's citationsneededcontact@gmail.com. Thank you, Catherine Turnbull, for helping us out, and we hope you enjoy your tote bag. But that said, we will get to our next bit of merch in just a little while, but let us continue down this amazing ancient aliens route.
Yeah, let's do the next clip on ancient Egypt, which is, I think, probably by far their most popular topic. They cover it pretty much every season through some new angle. I guess Akhenaten has a weird face, so therefore he's an alien, etc. I want to sort of talk a little bit, if you can, about we're going to watch that clip, talk about it, then I'm going to ask question number 2, Nima, if that's okay. So let's watch let's watch this clip about ancient Egypt here from Ancient Aliens.
But could there be another explanation for why the Egyptians regarded Khepri as a pilot? Ancient astronaut theorists suggest that the representation of Khepri as a scarab, and sometimes as a human with a scarab head, may have been inspired by actual contact the Egyptians had with an otherworldly being.
With a celestial beetle?
One has to wonder whether or not these beings
one does not have to wonder
existed, because the ancient Egyptians were incredibly proud in carving their history into countless of walls. And according to the ancient astronaut theory, we all came about through a deliberate mutation of our genes. And so it is entirely possible, in my opinion, that some of those creatures that we see depicted in reliefs and in carvings might have actually existed in the past.
Is it possible the ancient Egyptians could have encountered alien beings that had an insect-like appearance? Ancient astronaut theorists say yes. And as further evidence, point to the fact that the Egyptians' obsession with the scarab also extended to their funerary rituals.
All right. This goes on and on.
All right,
we can cut it there.
The scarab, of course, was a sort of way in which ancient Egyptians, through various, I guess, time frames, would communicate, send notes to people, etc. They are saying that the scarab is evidence that they ran into an alien, a celestial beetle.
With like a human body with a beetle face. That's what aliens
bug
look
head,
like.
right?
Yeah. So what are your initial
no
thoughts?
Other possible interpretation.
What are your initial thoughts on the sort of
is it possible
on the epistemological problems with that clip? And then secondly, what can you discuss their kind of their coverage of ancient Egypt more broadly, specifically the conspiracy mongering surrounding the pyramids, obviously the most famous kind of ancient aliens theory?
Yeah, my first reaction, especially looking at some of the art that they showed, there's this obsessive literalism that the show has taken on, where there is no room for imagination, there's no room for art, there's no room for storytelling, that it must literally be what's depicted. And of course, through their funhouse mirror, whatever being depicted is literally an alien. And this was one, it was a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, where Tsoukalos, the guy with the hair who was in the clip and is in all the memes, said at one of the AlienCon events that all religious experiences were misinterpreted alien encounters. I'd have to double check the quote, but it is very it's all, anything religious is actually just aliens. And
that is very
they
sad.
do this with like any stories or any legends or any piece of art. And the certitude of their explanation always just sort of drives me crazy, where it's like, look, aliens might be real. Like I get this all the time when I say like ancient aliens is bunk, and they're like, oh, but aliens might, like, no, I'm not saying aliens couldn't be real, but how do you look at one drawing of a guy with a scarab head and say aliens, that's it, done, like end of story? Like, what if, like, I got a 5-year-old, she loves bugs, like, draws weird things and puts bugs on things, like
alien.
There's no room for creativity and storytelling and fun in these explanations. And that's a real problem, because it denies humanity as we know it to exist in every form.
Sorry, go ahead. I apologize.
No, please go ahead. We can lean over to pyramid stuff, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, because there's so much, it's such an interesting line of research of why did certain animals create certain, or were part of such myths. What other cultures have similar animals that operated a similar way? Why would it be? There's so many questions, so many academic questions you could study for many, many lifetimes. And instead it's just like, oh, it's aliens. And it's an anti-intellectual exercise. Because it's the end of the conversation. But if you can, please talk to us about the sort of their coverage of the pyramids more broadly. They bring it up now and then, but it's basically like, oh, this looks really difficult, therefore aliens. Obviously, that's the most popular.
And Tsuklos, if he watches, will get very angry if we say that, because they don't say aliens built the pyramids. He's like, we never said that, and it's like, no, they just heavily imply it all the time, or they imply that people couldn't have done it without. I actually fundamentally love Nima. You brought up Garrett Service and Edison's conquest of Mars earlier on here. What I want to emphasize, like, they go back to Egypt all the time because Egypt is popular, it's famous, people know it, they've heard about it, and that's one of the main reasons they go there, is it seems mysterious, and it's been labeled as mysterious since ancient Greek times. People forget about this, or it's hard to conceptualize this sometimes, but like Cleopatra has been in the news lately because there's a new Netflix show about Cleopatra. Like there's less time between us and Cleopatra than there was between Cleopatra and the building of the pyramids at Giza. Like, for the Ptolemaic dynasties, for the ancient Greeks, Egypt was ancient and old to them, and not fully understood. And so, like, we've had this view of Egypt as this mysterious place for a long time. And what you left out about Garrett Service, which I love, is that it is, as far as I'm aware, it is the first time anyone said aliens built the pyramids. And it's in this explicitly science fiction context where the humans travel to Mars in his book, and they fight the Martians on Mars, and then when they get to Mars, they find a colony of humans living there on Mars, and they're like, "How did you get here?" And they're like, "Oh, the aliens brought us here when they came to Earth thousands of years ago, and when they were on Earth, they built the pyramids, they carved the Sphinx." And what I really love about that too is, if listeners aren't familiar with Garrett Service's old, book, you might have watched Stargate, which is more or less the same plot as Garrett Service's book, rehashed out over with a little bit more explicit of the ancient alien pastiche over on top of it. Like, the show feeds off of Egyptomania, which has such a long, complex history. It's been going on for so long, but it absolutely feeds off that assumption of mystery, that assumption of misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, so there's also this idea that I want to make sure, even though we're talking a lot about aliens, we will continue to, that there is often another thread that runs through this pseudo-archaeology, which is that cultures that couldn't possibly be in contact were actually like the same, or which gets into this Atlantean idea. But you've actually noted in your own writing, David, that Ignatius Donnelly back in the 1880s made certain connections that were frankly dubious. Can you just talk a little bit about the kind of Mesoamerican, or how like Egypt and Mayan cultures have been conflated in these theories, and how that serves to also, like, where does that come from, and what is the impetus behind trying to make those connections?
There's a little bit of this, Donnelly did a lot of this, what we call now diffusionism. And Donnelly, I would call a hyper diffusionist, where, like, if you find one thing in the archaeological record, if you find red pottery, it's like, well, where did that red pottery come from? Like, oh, they have it here. Well, if they had it here, it must have traveled from one place to another. It must have been invented in one place and diffused somewhere else. And that absolutely does happen. But Donnelly took it to this, like, totally extreme level. Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book in the 1880s called Atlantis and the Antediluvian World, or Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This was like the first book where he's like, I'm going to find Atlantis. I'm going to prove that Atlantis is real. Like there's earlier discussions of it here and there, but this is the guy who sort of we can blame for a lot of things. And yeah, he knew, like, he was very much feeding off of the fame of Heinrich Schliemann, who about 10 years earlier had allegedly found the Greek city of Troy. And we still have archaeologists working at the site. The site is called Husarlik in modern day Turkey. And, you know, there's still some, like, is it Troy? Is it not Troy? Like, it kind of doesn't matter, I feel like, but some people do feel like it is. And, you know, Troy derives from Greek tradition and Greek poetry. And so there's a very real sense that the wars presented in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey might be based in some reality. And, you know, so when Schliemann found Troy, people got really excited. And there are several folks who started saying, like, well, if we could find Troy, maybe we could find Atlantis, which totally ignores that where the story of Atlantis comes from is completely different from where the story of Troy comes from. And the one and only source for Atlantis is Plato. Plato was not a folklorist or a collector of stories or a historian. Plato was a philosopher, and he, in virtually all of his dialogues, makes up examples to sort of demonstrate his points to his readers. And in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he talks about Atlantis, and it's a very clear. There's so many details to break down, but it's a very clear parable to the citizens of Athens to not be prideful, because if you're prideful, like the Atlanteans were, the gods will smack you down and destroy you. But obviously, Donnelly thinks, he can't find it because it's on the ocean floor, but he thinks that, well, maybe he can find the remnants of its existence. And so he starts looking at the archaeological record from around the world. But it's the 1880s. Like, archaeology is still pretty new at that point. And basically, what a lot of his book comes down to is to say, well, Egypt has pyramids, and the Maya built pyramids, and so and it's like it's really pretty much that, like, simple. And he there's moments in there he's like, well, the Egyptians had agriculture, and the Maya had agriculture. It's like they're totally different plants. Like, they're different. They're not growing the same things in the same environment. At one point he says, like, well, the Egyptians have writing, and the Maya have writing. Yeah, totally different languages, totally different structurally different writing systems,
different millennia.
Yeah.
So
and what we didn't totally know, but we absolutely know today, is most of his Egyptian examples were like Old Kingdom pyramids and stuff, and most of his Maya examples were classic period Maya, which basically means there's also about 3,000 years in between, sort of separating his examples as well, of saying that they're so similar. And so he just goes, like, above and beyond to say, like, any basic level similarity must mean it has some sort of common origin. And just like the only possible answer is aliens, for Donnelly, the only possible answer to the vaguest similarities was they had to come out of Atlantis.
Right.
And this is stuck with us, this is what a lot of pseudo-archaeological authors do to this day. Where they find any similarity that they can and say, like, well, that vague similarity must be absolute. One of my all-time favorites, I don't remember exactly where this originated, but it's all over the internet. You can find it to this day. There's a really famous site also in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that is very, very old, probably a temple site built by mobile hunter-gatherers. And there's some carved limestone uprights at this site that have various designs on them. And at one point, there's sort of like two U-shaped designs, like a line in between them. And it's a relatively simplistic line drawing. And somebody found a photo of an Australian Aboriginal that had a similar drawing on his, like, chest. And they're like, same. Has to be the same. Forget that there's like 12,000 years separating these images, and that they're just line drawings. There's this assumption, like, where I feel like I hit this a lot. There was a brief Masonic joke earlier, but the Masons, like, do a lot for me in some of this work too. Like, there's this assumption a lot of people have in the Western world that symbols have inherent meanings that are fixed and never change. It's like symbols mean whatever we want them to mean, and those meanings change constantly. But it's this slew of packing all these things together, where it's like any vague similarities, like, yeah, must be Atlantis or must be aliens in some way, shape, or form, and it echoes for us in so many ways.
Especially
I think I've drifted far from your question.
No, especially since
great.
it seems like discussing why there's certain, for want of a better term, evolutionary convergence is so inherently interesting, because it does ask kind of questions about the axiomatic like nature of humans, right? Like why would we both develop, agriculture this way? I mean, that seems like a sort of really fascinating question to find a common origin, rather than just saying, oh, well, they clearly had an alien just skip over from South America to North Africa, right?
Yeah, we need a neurologist, because like a lot of cultures do build symmetrical buildings. And I'll see like 3 doorways get used as examples all the time. There's like, this building has 3 doorways. This building has 3 doorways. They must be the same. We need a neurologist or somebody who can explain this better than I can. But it's like, people apparently really like symmetry, and there's something human about that rather than extraterrestrial or conspiratorial.
Yeah. Right.
Well, this is a perfect place for us to take a brief pause and do our next merch giveaway. This is, after all, a fundraiser. We implore those of you who are listening, if you enjoy the show, please do consider supporting us. You can go to patreon.com/citationsneeded-podcast. Your support for the show keeps the show going. But we are going to do our second giveaway. We're going to be giving away 2 t-shirts this time. So 2 people are going to come away from this with a sweet Citations Needed t-shirt of your design and color choice. We'll get into that in a sec. So again, if you do not already support the show, please do head over to patreon.com/citationsneeded-podcast. Sign up now in the next 15 minutes or so, and drop a note in the YouTube chat to let us know. And then those of you who sign up, or if you are already a supporter, let us know that too. If you bump up your level of support, you'll have an even better chance. And we are going to, again, randomly pick some names from you wonderful new and current supporters, and we will let you know who wins in a little bit. But that leads us into, Adam, our next amazing
I think in the interest of time, we have to skip the Leonardo da Vinci part. Even it's not even that relevant to our general theme. I just think it's hilarious. So I'll give you
a pretty good one.
I know, but it's really long, and I want to move on to Ancient Apocalypse, because I do think.
Can you give a brief?
I'll do a brief.
I feel like that was such a tease.
This is one of the ones I watched ironically. I used to watch Ancient Aliens ironically many years ago. And back when I drank a lot. It's really good when you're drunk. There's basically like a gap in the record for 2 years of where Leonardo da Vinci, like his life, because obviously we don't have documentation of everyone's life from 500 years ago.
He wasn't on Instagram.
No. And they surmise from this that aliens abducted him, brought him in a teleporter. Ancient alien theorists believe, possibly, what if they put him in a wormhole to the future where he saw various inventions, and then he went back and tried to sketch them, because there's no precedent for it. Obviously, there's a ton wrong with that. There's a ton wrong with that, namely the idea that like people can't have certain insights. And I want to ask you a question about that, Dr. Anderson, if you'll indulge me. One of the things I think is kind of annoying about these shows is that humans in the past were, the assumption is that for the most part, they're just really dumb. They're kind of stupefied. I know that temporalism or timeism is not a form of discrimination, but there is I'm trying to find a better term for it. But basically, like, oh, they're just old and therefore they were stupid. And there is something, like you talked about earlier, about this sort of there's something bleak about that. There's something very sad about that. How you view these moments of ingenuity or brilliance, and then you dismiss it as aliens. You have
to write it. You have to write it away. You have to write it out of human possibility.
Can you talk about this kind of temporal chauvinism?
Yeah, and they've kicked back a lot on this recently, which is sort of interesting. But there's this fundamental assumption that no one could have figured out how to carve stone or move large stones without some sort of alien help even though we've seen people do these things all over the world time and time again, it is interesting. There is this sort of fundamental dismissal of human ingenuity, and you see it kind of with the diffusionism stuff as well, where it's like especially when you get to this hyper diffusionism, like only once could somebody have invented anything, and then we must instead decide that it spread from there, or that it was gifted by aliens, or it was gifted by some lost civilization. Whereas what we obviously see in the world around us today is that people are endlessly creative and capable. It's really strange and is really sad. And I think one of the ways that I like to approach this too, or like I say to people, like, if you look at the pyramids or you look at these monuments and you think like, oh man, like it's so amazing. It couldn't have been humans. It must have been aliens. Like, guess what? We can show you that it was the people. And how much more amazing is that?
Yeah, it's way more
do
amazing.
This.
Which I think, sorry, before we move on past Ancient Aliens, we'd be remiss if we didn't address the big elephant in the room, which is that these shows have their origins in racism. Now, you mentioned the racism of big archaeology. That is its own problem. We'll maybe discuss that in a little bit, but discuss the racism inherent in much of this discourse, especially Chariots of the Gods and where those kind of currents come from, and talk about that, if you would.
Yeah. So baseline here is that if you look at their examples, like, who needed alien help? Well, it wasn't the Romans building the Colosseum. They don't usually bring stuff like that in. It was usually indigenous populations in Africa or in the Americas or somewhere over in Asia. Like, there's the vast majority of their examples come from non-Western cultures or cultures that are not traditionally tagged as white. And so it's this really, it's subtle sometimes, and it's not everyone picks up on it. And that's where, like, it's, if you watch the show and you're like, wow, that was really cool, like, it doesn't make you a racist. But, if you look at the grand arc of all of their examples that people like Eric von Däniken use, the TV show use, they habitually go to non-Western cultures. Von Däniken got really explicit about this in the later 70s. As his fame grew, I don't know if he wasn't being edited as much, or if he just thought he could write more blatantly about this. But in some of his books in the later 70s, he started including sort of explicitly racist language as well. Like there's one line about the black race being a failed alien experiment. Like, there's some really explicit stuff where it's like he's not hiding what's going on here anymore. He's actually saying the quiet part out loud. Mm-hmm. He's stopped doing that more or less since then, as I think, kind of realized maybe it wasn't a good idea to say it out loud. But there's a big problem here where, the vast majority of these things, the vast majority of all these things, like the Atlantis stuff, the ancient alien stuff, a lot of it really gets its start in the 18th century, or sometimes in the 1800s, or sometimes the 1700s, where European colonialists started traveling around the world, and they would find monuments, and they had profoundly pejorative views of indigenous peoples. And they would look at those monuments and they'd say, couldn't be the locals, must be a lost white race. And gradually, we've seen that lost white race literally be Atlantis sometimes, or sometimes it's being replaced by aliens instead. And so there's a lot of ways where, like, these claims are, basically saying, indigenous people of color couldn't build anything on their own, and generally speaking, ignoring Europe.
Yeah, there must be some sort of jealousy there also, because, like, the ancestors of the, discoverers didn't leave lasting monuments of the same age, right? And engineering feat that then they saw elsewhere in, say, global South or
especially because these people in Britain were
they're like, I guess it was shit. Stonehenge, but not a pyramid.
That's Bush League. I could do Stonehenge.
Well, it's like people are perfectly happy to say, like, oh, medieval European cathedrals took generations to build. Like, it's, of course, you can do these complex buildings with simple tools. It's not hard. It's actually one of my favorites. I know I didn't mention to you guys, but this is a long clip in like season 1 episode of Ancient Aliens. I make my students watch it all the time. There's this great interview with a sculptor who's like, they couldn't possibly have carved these stones. At the very end of the interview, he's like, well, it just would have taken a lot of time.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, they had time.
They had time.
There wasn't
They
a lot
also
going on.
threw a lot of people at it, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
this whole element of like forced labor, if slaves built the pyramids, or, how like that. If you throw thousands of bodies over many years into doing something, that's another thing that is then written away. Right. When you have aliens just sort of be like, and then alien technology and alien blueprints taught these, very receptive people to then build these things over time.
Yeah.
Right. And you completely skirt the idea of like, well, what were the power dynamics of those societies? What even like, building like, funeral monuments to pharaohs is itself, I mean, like there is a power structure there that's then not being investigated when you're just like, it was aliens who did this crazy thing.
And we should say, I know we're trying to move on, but Garrett Service is out there in the open with his book. Ancient Aliens continues in science fiction through the 20s and the 30s. Pulp fiction writers are writing about it regularly. In the 40s and the 50s, comic book writers start picking it up. The whole idea that humans were guided by aliens, that aliens taught us architecture, that alien technology was magic, that aliens were gods, all of that stuff is a science fiction trope by like the 40s. 20 years before von Däniken claims it's all real, it's been repeatedly used over and over again in science fiction. Like it's really odd that this became believed by so many people. And I want to throw that out there actually too, because people always say like, nobody believes it. They just watch it for fun. We do actually have survey data. The best survey data and most recent survey data I have is from 2018, where in that survey, 42% of the respondents, Americans, said, yep, they agree or strongly agree that ancient alien contact actually happened. So like I wave that number at other archaeologists all the time, where it's like almost half the country thinks we're lying. Like that is a disciplinary problem.
Yeah, because these pop discourses do matter. When we first said we first talked about doing the show, we were always like, isn't it kind of a little bit of low hanging fruit, or kind of playing the game on easy mode, because we try to take on big targets. But then you're like, no, actually, these are produced by large corporations, by Netflix, Warner Brothers, A&E, like they do permeate the culture, because like you said, they contribute to a mindless skepticism of the scientific establishment, right? Not a thoughtful skepticism, not criticisms of institutional
It can be
racism.
fun and also do that.
Right, exactly.
The fact that it's fun makes it
correct.
Like spoonful
because
of
again, you want to be skeptical of institutions in some ways, but it has to be a constructive skepticism, or skepticism based in some kind of material reality, not totally batshit stuff. And I think this gets to the more recent iteration, more frustrating iteration of Graham Hancock, which I want to transition into now. This show has been immensely popular for Netflix.
Yes.
As these
Ancient
things often
Apocalypse,
are.
just to
Ancient
name,
Apocalypse.
Ancient Apocalypse, not to be confused with Ancient Aliens. I think the assonance is not a coincidence, and no pun intended. I do want to.
Well, that's his first book is Fingerprints of the Gods, like Chariots of the Gods. Like he's been echoing them all along.
So let's talk about Graham Hancock, what his deal is, your relationship with his career in terms of your own personal kind of interests. What is his basic shtick?
The basic argument all along since the 90s has been that there is this lost civilization from 10 to 12,000 years ago. He's changed the date a few times, existed. And just like we've been talking about, that it sort of brought wisdom to the world, and that the reason we see similarities in architecture or art in different continents and different sites and different cultures all around the world is because they have a common origin in some way, shape, or form in his lost civilization. He's added new elements. Very interested in the Younger Dryas and whether or not the Earth was hit by a comet during the Younger Dryas period, which is a period of cooling in Earth's recent history. He's very interestingly, he had mostly avoided the word Atlantis throughout most of his career, but in the show he opened up. He's like, "We're looking for Atlantis." He's usually avoided that. I can't claim to get inside of his head and figure out all of this, but this is the problem. And I want to say this again. I know I said it earlier, but like, I became interested in archaeology by reading one of his books. That's why I'm here. It's why I got into archaeology. It's what lit a fire under my butt and got me to learn more about this stuff. I am not a hater. I don't think he's a horrible person.
I'm a hater.
He's gotten very bitter in the at least recently, which is really sad to see. But fundamentally, his evidence is just not there. Like, and this is one where it's like, again, when I read the book when I was like 18, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And then I learned about all the stuff that he didn't mention, right? Like, he is cherry picking little tiny examples from one site and another site and saying like, let's look at these two examples and ignore the tens of thousands of pieces of data that we have from pottery sherds and stone tools and architecture and sites from all around these spaces. I mean, it's really sad. I get really sad when I've tried to engage and talk with people who like his stuff sometimes when I can. Their rhetoric has gotten really vitriolic in the last, even before the show came out, but since the show came out, like I have been on Twitter a lot less since that show came out because I don't really feel like being called an asshole 10 times a day. And it's like, I'm glad you like him. That's great. So cherry picking a handful of examples and taking them out of context.
What do they say your motive is? Because oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, all the time they talk about the archaeology establishment.
Yeah.
And, we pride ourselves on being a show that takes on the establishment. We hope a real one, not a sort of earth sense or fake one. What is the motive? Is it just from their perspective? Is there I want to be generous here. Is it a cabal? Is it sort of groupthink? Is it like what? I mean, if someone had real proof of these kind of earth-shattering, existential, paradigm-shifting theories, why would this quote-unquote establishment archaeology be resistant to it? Is it simply like too many careers are on the line? What's the motivated reasoning here, supposedly?
Wouldn't that be the most exciting part of the gig?
Yeah. The argument he's been pushing for years is that archaeologists have to maintain their paradigm, that they won't look outside of their paradigm, that their careers depend on defending the established knowledge base, which is, again, this is one of these things that, like, as I learned more about archaeology, as I met archaeologists and started to become one, was fundamentally false. Like the best thing I could ever find in my life as an archaeologist is something that challenges established opinion, because it gives me a reason to publish and it gives me something to talk about at conferences. It gets my name paid attention to.
It's sexy.
It's great. Like I've had two experiences with this in a sense where one of my very first article that I ever got published in an academic journal, it took about 6 months to get officially accepted. And it was accepted and it was published. And I found out later from some folks of like, why did it take 6 months to get approved? And the answer was basically nothing was controversial about it. It was just like here's some new data, there you go. And there was nothing for people to get upset about or excited about. And so we had a hard time getting reviewers. So it's like literally, as someone who just kind of, one of my first articles was maintaining the status quo. I had a hard time getting it published because it just maintained the status quo. And conversely, like I've had some of the most fun in my career. When I was in grad school, I was on a project where we were doing survey in the Maya world, looking to find sites that hadn't been documented before. And very randomly, one of the things we found a lot of ball courts. The Maya played a game where you bounce a rubber ball off your hip and you bounce it back and forth and you try not to drop it. And the vast majority of the literature on the ball game is elite focused. We have large architectural examples of these courts at big sites with nice fancy art and hieroglyphs and other things. But we found a whole bunch of ball courts at little tiny villages. And we found them at really old villages that were from what's called the pre-classic period. So these were probably about 500 BC, more or less. And all of a sudden, I had this like landscape in front of me of little villages playing a ball game. And I had a new argument about community building and relationship building and how, you can have conflict with one another and resolve that conflict without fighting one another, right? It's like, I've published probably the more on that, where I have challenged the status quo on, how do we interpret and how do we understand the Maya ball game than anything else on the Maya. Like there's this argument that, that archaeologists are defending the status quo, that if you want to be an archaeologist, if you want to get a job, if you want to stay in the career, that you cannot challenge mainstream archaeology. It is fundamentally ridiculous.
Yeah.
If there was evidence that Atlantis was real, I'd happily champion that. If there was evidence, I love science fiction. I bought a book. I not remember the name of it. It's in my university office, not at home. But it was a recent book about the actual search for extraterrestrial life, like what xenobiologists have found, what astronomers are finding. And it was one of these books where I'm like, as soon as I heard about it, I'm like, I want that book. I want there to be extraterrestrial life. It'd be amazing. It was such a boring book. It was like, the answer is we just don't have any data. Like there's so little data out there. And if this stuff would be true, I'd be the first person jumping up and down saying look, I've got this evidence. I've got this evidence.
No.
It don't. And
all you got to do is you got to claim that, aliens taught the Mayans hacky sack, and then boom.
That's fine. Like rubber. Like how else could the Maya have learned how to make rubber balls?
So with that being said, let's watch a clip from.
Before we do, I have to announce our two wonderful winners for t-shirts. We thank you so much for signing up to support the show. There is Slovenly Muse and Big Gamer 2525. That's what happens when we do this on the line. Slovenly Muse and Big Gamer 2525. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Please, again, email us right now if you can at citationsneededcontact@gmail.com. Again, that's citationsneededcontact@gmail.com. And with that, we're going to go into our final giveaway of the night before we get to the ancient apocalypse clips. And continue our fascinating conversation with Dr. Anderson. Thank you so much for sticking around with us. This has been so great. But we're going to do our final giveaway now. So those of you who have not yet signed up, please do now. Or if you have done so already during the course of this begathon, you are still in the running, right? It doesn't have to be every 15-minute, 20-minute, half-hour increment. If you have newly signed up, please drop something in the chat. Let us know. If you tried to get that tote bag and you didn't get it, you're in the running for the new one now, but you have to drop another comment in the chat so that we see your name in there and can put that in our randomizer so that you can potentially get the new prize, which I am happy to announce will be a piece of merch of your choosing. So whatever you see on our bonfire page and you're like, I want that thing. If you win this next and final giveaway, you can let us know what you want.
We should do a mug. I think we should do a cruise like The Nation does, where they awkwardly put you on a boat with their contributing editors,
with some of their writers.
I don't mean dump on The Nation. I love The Nation. My wife writes with them, but it's funny though. It's like The Nation cruise is this thing that's been around since the 90s, and it's like a thing. And then they're at the very bottom. Sorry, I'm being a little catty here. At the very bottom, it's like we purchased carbon offsets, and I'm like, okay. That seems a little suspect. But anyway, we're not doing the
Citations cruise. We're doing Citations cruise. Dave Zirin's going to be there, I promise.
But it's the bar at the archaeology tour boat in Chicago that goes through the river. We're just all right.
That's what we're going to do. So anyway, sign up if you haven't already. If you have signed up during the course of this begathon, you are still in the running, but please do drop another comment in the YouTube chat. If you are currently a subscriber, a supporter of Citations Needed, endless thanks to you. Throw your name in the chat too. We're going to randomize this shit, and then you're going to get whatever you want off the bonfire page when you get in touch with us after we pick your name, and I'll announce it in a little bit. But with that, Adam, let's get to our first ancient apocalypse clip.
Maybe our first and only, but here we go.
Maybe only. We'll see. This is from episode 2 called Survivor in a Time of Chaos, in which, again, Graham Hancock, whose work kind of lays the basis for all of this, he lays out his hypothesis, citing examples of shared mythologies among ancient cultures worldwide. This is part of what we've been talking about. He opens with a discussion of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl.
The legend of Quetzalcoatl has been told for generations, even down to today. We get a description of a heavily bearded individual. He sounds a bit like a foreigner from across the ocean, and he brings the gifts of civilization. What I find so astonishing is how often we've heard this story from cultures that supposedly had no connection with ancient Mexico. The setting is always the same. There has been a giant cataclysm. The world has been plunged into darkness, floods, chaos everywhere. Society is collapsing. And then out of the darkness appears a figure who has knowledge of what is necessary to make a civilization. And that figure teaches the demoralized survivors of the cataclysm how to start civilization.
Demoralized?
In ancient Greek mythology, it's the Titan Prometheus who, after a great flood, shares with humans the secret of fire. In the South American Andes, pre-Inca civilizations describe a robed, bearded figure named Viracocha, who emerged from a great lake and taught the local people how to create amazing works of masonry that still exist today. Even in the Pacific, Polynesian legends talk of Maui, who created their islands by pulling them up from the ocean floor, and then taught the islanders to work with stone tools and to cook their food. Archaeologists say that these civilizing heroes are just inventions of the ancients, elaborate fictions. But I find the similarities hard to ignore. What if these accounts describe the survivors of an advanced civilization that was lost in the great cataclysms of flood and fire that we know occurred near the end of the last ice age?
Why is he leering at?
All right, let's do it. Let's cut it.
All
right.
Oh, there's so much there. That was so painful. I'm sorry. Dr. Anderson.
No, it makes me sad. It honestly makes me sad, where it's like we're taking human diversity and reducing it to this. And so, one, like, Hancock has done this before. Many other authors have done this before. Flood myths. All cultures around the world have flood myths. It must mean they have a connection. What if that connection is rivers flood and it's scary as all get out when they do, because they will destroy your town? The idea that multiple people have flood myths and therefore they must have a common origin just fundamentally denies the fact that floods happen most places around the world and that they are massively destructive. Of course, people have stories,
and humans have a tendency to
floods.
And humans have a tendency to go around bodies of water. Is the, I think, the common.
Yeah, because you need the water to live.
You need the water to live. Therefore, when the water sometimes gets out of hand, right?
Yeah, water falls from the sky sometimes too, which is like super crazy.
And I'd love to see him pull his sources, but these ideas that Quetzalcoatl has a beard, that's code for white. That is to say, well, he's not indigenous, because we know indigenous populations have very light facial hair in the Americas. And so what he's saying, is that, like, well, then a white person came to the Maya or the Aztec. We're talking about Aztec in particular with Quetzalcoatl here.
I believe that's Joseph Smith theory of events, if I'm not mistaken.
There's some of that stuff going on. He's not the only person that's done this. That's the thing, is the idea, claims that Quetzalcoatl is a bearded white man, claims that Viracocha is a red-haired, blue-eyed white man. These are things that were made up in the 1800s by European
if I'm not mistaken,
colonialists.
a great deal of the Book of Mormon was semi-plagiarized from a science fiction contemporary science fiction book that was popular that I think had a similar thing where tribes of Israel went to North America, because everybody at that point, I think, was trying to retcon in some kind of biblical origin story of the United States, right? Not to sort of get off topic here, but to your point, this is a similar thing. The idea that whites came to North America and South America, it's not a new idea.
I mean, there's a huge amount of this with the myth in North America, in the United States, with the so-called myth of the mound builders, where there are earthen mounds all over the eastern half of the United States that were built by indigenous peoples, but settler colonialists looked at those mounds and said, well, that couldn't be native people. They couldn't have built that. It's piled up earth. That's too complex. And so there are all these myths of white races coming somehow from Europe or elsewhere and building them, and that later the indigenous peoples chased off in their inherent savagery. I'm putting quotes around savagery there, that, you know, their inherent savagery, that they chased off the mound builders. And literally, that's the excuse that Andrew Jackson gave for removing indigenous people to the west of the Mississippi that resulted in the Trail of Tears. In an address before the United States Congress, Andrew Jackson said that it was okay to remove indigenous people because it wasn't their land. It was mound builder land. Like, this is old 19th and 18th century racist ideology, and he's reusing it. And it's like, this is where, like, the internet and Twitter has gone nuts, people calling Hancock racist. And I'm not calling him racist. Like, I don't think he's doing this deliberately. He's not thinking. He's so tied up in being right. And he's been making the same claims since the 90s that he doesn't ever stop and think, like, where do these ideas come from? Where, you know, and what's the actual evidence behind them? It's really, as someone who got interested in archaeology because of one of his books, like, it just makes me sad that he has not stopped for a second to rethink any of these things.
Yeah, the going back to the idea of this, you know, again, symbolism, but in this case, bearded figures being, you know, white or European, you know, to that point, and to get back to Ignatius Donnelly, who we've been bringing up, you know, Hancock in his 1995 book, Fingerprints of the Gods, cites Donnelly, who was a U.S. congressman, by the way.
And ran for vice president.
And Graham writes this, like, quote, "The road system and the sophisticated architecture had been," this is according to Donnelly, "ancient in the time of the Incas, but that both the architecture and the road system, quote, were the work of white auburn-haired men," end quote. You know, again, getting back to this, you know, Diluvian idea, to kind of putting mythology into history, into archaeology. Donnelly, in his 1882 book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which you had mentioned before, he you know, suggests that an ancient civilization called Atlantis was destroyed by a flood, and its survivors then taught indigenous people the practices of agriculture and architecture. And Hancock draws on Donnelly all the time. And so you just see these ideas, you know, cycle again and again. And you know, it's not just from the 1880s to the 1990s. You're now seeing this in, you know, this year, last year, in these highly, you know, big money produced Netflix specials.
Yeah, it's remarkable how little has changed in terms, like you said. I mean, much of Hancock's work is just echoing stuff that's been said for ages. And at least when Donnelly was writing, like, I will give Donnelly a little bit of credit. There wasn't that much known in the Western world about the Inca or the Maya or the Aztec. We know a lot now. There's been tons of excavation and studies that have been done. There's no excuse. You know, when he wrote that in 95 or published it in 95, there was absolutely no excuse to make that argument. And I don't know if he's backpedaled that one at all since then, but you know, he's not changed his fundamental thesis here in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, can't we, sorry, forgive me, I'm going to ask a rather ignorant question. I know there are different kinds of, for want of a better term, dating, atomic dating. Like, I understand that's developed quite a bit. Is there, I mean, it seems like if something's, you know, 100,000 years old or whatever the number he throws out is, can't we test that, or have there ways of testing that?
Yeah, archaeological dating is complex, and it's takes a lot of work and a lot of context to be able to get a good date. But we have radiocarbon dating, we have stratigraphic dating that we still use to this day. Yeah, there is a lot of archaeological dates are based on a lot of research, and I see people throw them out all the time. This is sort of very common, and I love it in Ancient Aliens. There's always this like, well, here's this from here and here's that from there, and even in the clip we just watched where he's talking about the Viracocha among the in South America and the Aztec, there are chronological differences here. These aren't moments and times and spaces that are happening at the same time. Ancient Aliens is great at this, where they're like, look at this site, look at that site, look at this site. Like, you just traveled 5,000 years, and yet you're claiming that's all the scale. Archaeological dating is not simple, and it does involve revision, and dates are when new data comes in, dates can be revised sometimes. But yeah, we don't actually just make them up. There's,
for example, like how do we know that the pyramids are 4,500 years old for our listeners? Like, where does Wikipedia has a little date? Like, where does it come from?
So in large part, that is originally based on historical data, because we actually do have writing from Egypt that does mention the pyramids and have kings lists and whatnot that are dated through Egyptian calendar systems. But then there have also been radiocarbon dates done at the Giza Plateau with neighboring structures or with organic materials found in the pyramids. Radiocarbon dating only works on organic materials.
Right. That's an important thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's measuring how much, like, all living organic materials have a certain amount of radiocarbon in them.
Right.
That's a natural, that's sort of a cycle of life thing that's in our atmosphere.
Carbon-based life forms. So that, okay, right. Okay,
yeah, it shows up in the upper atmosphere, and then so it gets in all carbon-based life forms. Right. And so radiocarbon dating works by counting how much radiocarbon is left in an organic sample. And so what you're really doing with radiocarbon dating is dating how long ago something died. And so then we have to have some context where it's like, okay, that tree died, at this period of time. When is it being used to be built? And so, there is always, room for controversy. Like, this happens a lot in the desert Southwest, where it's so dry, and I'm sure it happens in Egypt too, but I don't know specific examples. But like in the desert Southwest, you'll see, a piece of wood being used as a house support, and that piece of wood might actually be a lot older than the house, because when one house is abandoned or collapses, that it's so dry you can reuse the wood, and so you can use it in the next house, and then the radiocarbon date then on that wood is much older than the actual house was. And so we have to do a lot of contextual work, like, where is something found, what is it found in association with. But yeah, like, there are radiocarbon dates from Giza. There are historical dates that back this up. There are papyri that describe Giza and blocks being delivered to Giza. Like, it is very firmly a part of Old Kingdom Egypt.
Because there was a lot of record keeping. The Egyptians were famous for being basically a nation of accountants, right? And that's from an archaeology perspective, that's helpful. Along with, I understand that the arid and dry climate is sort of a very good.
Oh yeah, no, I am. I'm glad. Actually, my spouse is also an archaeologist who works in Egypt, and whenever I go over there with her, I'm glad I don't work there. And that, I specifically mean that from a preservation perspective. It is so dry in Egypt that they literally will excavate papyri out of the ground sometimes. These reed paper records. It's like the Maya wrote a lot of books too, and I love Maya books. There are only 4 of them that survive to this day. Most of them were burned during the conquest. There is one additional one that was found in a ruler's tomb at the site of Copan in Honduras. But it's a pulpy mess. Like, it is, it's that humid tropical jungle. We will never be able to open that book up. Like, we've got it, it's there, we know what it is, never going to be able to open it up. And like the things that survive in the desert, just like, I wouldn't have time. I got time to deal with all that data.
Right.
It's too much good stuff. Well, speaking of good stuff, I have one last winner to announce. And then we will also wrap up this Begathon, this episode. This has been so amazing. We've been talking with Dr. David S. Anderson. archaeologist, of course, and assistant professor at Radford University in Virginia. But let me announce our winner, and then we will wrap. The winner, congratulations to Brett Warwick, the final winner of our merch giveaway. So congratulations, Brett. Brett, please do email us at citationsneededcontact@gmail.com so you can let us know what you want. And with that, we will start to wrap this up. Dr. Anderson, it has been so amazing talking to you. I think, my final question is, are you super excited for the new Indiana Jones movie to come out?
Oh no. I'm worried it's going to be about the Antikythera mechanism and time travel. So we'll see how.
Well, they did Aliens last time. They did
Aliens,
and
that was horrible.
Time. And it was the worst thing, and it doesn't.
That was
exist.
the worst goddamn movie I've ever seen.
It's the Godfather 3.
I don't think I've ever been let down more. I
was
so pumped up to go see that movie, and I walked out, and that in the initial first 20 minutes, you're like in denial, and you're like, "That was okay," and then you get home, and
it starts with a really good race
scene
to Area 51, and then it
love Crystal Skulls though. Crystal Skulls are amazing, and so the fourth one's actually my favorite one to rag on because there's lots of great actual paranormal and pseudo-archaeological stuff in there that people have actually claimed.
Right.
That's why I'm really worried about the Dial of Destiny right now, because 4 is full of. They hit on a lot of things that people actually claim to be real in that movie. I do a whole lecture on it in some of my classes sometimes, where it's like, here's all these pieces that they're pulling in there. And so, I'm kind of worried about Dial of Destiny here, where it's like, I think they're just going to jump down a well here and, give me more grief to deal with the next however many years.
If you are down with it, you've spent a lot of time with us already, so I hate to invite you back so soon, but feel free to come back on and talk to us about Indiana Jones, and we will do a whole Indiana Jones episode with you.
We'll see what Dial of Destiny gives us and go from there.
Sounds good.
And we will see what is brought to us from the aliens that give us all this new fodder. So, but that will do it for this live show, Citations Needed live show, and Begathon. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and an extra special thanks, of course, to our guest tonight, Dr. David S. Anderson, archaeologist and assistant professor at Radford University in Virginia. He specializes in the study of pseudo-archaeology and is the author of a forthcoming book entitled Weirding Archaeology, Unearthing the Strange Influences on the Popular Perception of Archaeology. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us today on Citations Needed.
Thank you both. Thank you, Nima. Thank you, Adam. And thank you to all you guys out there listening in. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
And that will do it for this episode of Citations Needed. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed. And if you are not already, please do support us through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated, as we are 100% listener funded. Congrats again to our winners tonight, Catherine Turnbull, as well as Brett Warwick, as well as, oh no, I'm losing the other two. They were erased from my thing, and now I don't know who they were. But
you know who you are, and that's what's important.
But you know who you are, and you've already written to us. I thought I was going to do a whole fun thing. Anyway, that will do it. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Citations Needed is produced by, Citations Needed senior producer, I'm losing it, is Florence Burrow Adams. Our producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trenda Lightburn. Newsletter by Marco Cardellano. Transcriptions are by Morgan McCaslin. The music is by Granddaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.